Alright, so I'm back. I'm reading more Into the Wild. Today I'm going to read chapter 13. It's called Virginia Beach. Uh, just a quick preface. This chapter is pretty short, and that's okay. I'll get through this chapter, and this is a good long 3-day weekend for Memorial Day. And if anybody needs to catch up on other chapters of videos that were longer, this is a good opportunity. So that way, when I come back next week after the long weekend, we can all be caught up on the same chapter. So I'll go ahead and start. It says, two framed photographs occupy the mantel in Corinne McCandless's Virginia Beach home. One of Chris as a junior in high school, and the other of Chris as a 7-year-old in a pint-sized suit and crooked tie, standing beside Corinne, who was wearing a frilly dress and a new Easter hat. What's amazing, says Corinne, as she studies these images of her brother and herself, is that even though the pictures were taken 10 years apart, his expression is identical. And she's right. Both photos, in both photos, Chris stares at the lens with the same pensive, rectilinear squint, as if he'd been interrupted in the middle of an important thought and was annoyed that he had to be wasting his time in front of the camera. His expression was most striking in the Easter photo because it contrasts so strongly with the exuberant grin of Corinne as she wears in the same frame. "That's Chris," she says with an affectionate smile, brushing her fingertips across the surface of the image. "He'd get that look a lot." Lying on the floor at Corinne's feet is Buckley, the Shetland sheepdog Chris had been so attached to. Now 13 years old, he's gone white in the muzzle and hobbles around with an arthritic limp. When Max, Corinne's 18-month-old Rottweiler, uh, intrudes on Buckley's turf, however, the alien little dog thinks nothing of confronting the much bigger animal with a loud bark and a flurry of well-placed snips, sending the 130-pound beast scurrying for safety. "Chris went crazy about Buck," says Corinne. "The summer he disappeared, he wanted to take Buck with him. After he graduated from Emory, he asked Mom and Dad if he could get Buck, and they said no, because Buckley had just been hit by a car and was still recovering. Now, of course, they second-guessed the decision. Even though Buck was hurt really bad, the vet said he'd never walk again from the accident. My parents can't help wondering, and I admit that I can't either, how things might have turned out different if Chris had taken Buck with him. Chris didn't think twice about risking his own life, but he never would have put Buckley in any kind of danger. There's no way he would have taken the same kind of chances if Buck had been with him. Standing 5 feet inches tall, standing 5 foot 8 inches tall, Corinne McCandless is the same height as her brother was, maybe an inch taller, and looks enough like him that people frequently ask if they were twins. An animated talker, she flips her waist-length hair from her face with a toss of her head as she speaks and chops at the air for emphasis with small, expressive hands. She is barefoot. A gold crucifix dangles from her neck. Her neatly pressed jeans have creases down the front. Like Chris, Corinne is energetic and self-assured, a high achiever, quick to state an opinion. And like Chris, she clashed fiercely with Walt and Billy as an adolescent. But the differences between the siblings were greater than their similarities. Corinne made peace with her parents shortly after Chris disappeared, and now, at the age of 22, she calls her relationship extremely good. She is much more gregarious than Chris was, and can't imagine going off into the wilderness, or virtually anywhere else, alone. And although she shares Chris's sense of outrage over racial injustice, Corinne has no objection, moral or otherwise, to wealth. She recently bought an expensive new home and regularly logs 14-hour days at CAR Services, Incorporated, the auto repair business she owns with her husband, Chris Fish, in the hope of making her first million at an early age. "I was always getting on Mom and Dad's case because they worked all the time and were never around," she reflects with a self-mocking laugh. "And now look at me. I'm doing the same thing. Chris," she confesses, "used to poke fun at her capitalist zeal by calling her the Duchess of York, Ivana Trump McCandless, and a rising successor to Leona Hemsley." His criticism of his sister never went beyond good-natured ribbing, however. Chris and Corinne were uncommonly close. In a letter delineating the quarrels with Walt and Billy, Chris once wrote to her, "Anyway, I like to talk to you about this because you're probably the only person in the world who could possibly understand what I'm saying." 10 months after Chris's death, Corinne still grieves deeply for her brother. I can't seem to get through a day without crying, she says with a look of puzzlement. For some reason, the worst is when I'm in the car by myself. Not once have I been able to make it the 20-minute drive from home to the shop without thinking about Chris and breaking down. I get over it, but when it happens, it's hard. On the evening of September 17th, 1992, Corinne was outside giving her Rottweiler a bath when Chris Fish pulled in the driveway. She was surprised he was home so early. Usually Fish worked late at the service center. He was acting funny, Corinne recalls, and there was a terrible look on his face. He went inside, came back out, and started helping me wash Max. I knew something was wrong then, because Fish never washes the dog. I need to talk to you, he said. Corinne followed him into the house, rinsed Max's collars in the kitchen sink, and went to the living room. Fish was sitting on the couch in the dark with his head down. He looked totally hurt. Trying to joke him out of his mood, I said, "What's wrong with you?" I figured his buddies must have been razzling him at work, maybe telling him they'd see me with another guy or something. I laughed and asked, "Have the guys been giving you a hard time?" But he didn't laugh back. When he looked up at me, I saw that his eyes were red. "It's your brother," he said. "They found him, and he's dead." Sam, Walt's oldest child, had called Fish at work and given him the news. Corinne's eyes blurred, and she felt the onset of tunnel vision. Involuntarily, she started shaking her head back and forth, back and forth. "No," she corrected him. "He isn't dead." Then she began to scream. Her keening was so loud and continuous that Fish worried the neighbors were going to think he was harming her and call the police. Corinne curled up on the couch in a fetal position, wailing without pause. When Fish tried to comfort her, she pushed him away and entreated him to leave her alone. She remained hysterical for the next 5 hours, but by 11 o'clock she had calmed sufficiently to throw some clothes in a bag, get into the car with Fish, and let him drive her to Walt and Billy's house in Chesapeake Beach, a 4-hour trip north. On our way out of Virginia Beach, Corinne asked Fish to stop at their church. I went in and sat at the altar for an hour or so while Fish stayed in the car, Corinne remembers. I wanted some answers from God, but I never got any. Earlier in the evening, Sam had confirmed that the photograph of the unknown hiker faxed down from Alaska was indeed Chris, but the coroner in Fairbanks required Chris's dental records to make a conclusive identification. It took more than a day to compare the x-rays, and Billy refused to look at the faxed photo until the dental ID had been completed and there was no longer any doubt whatsoever that the starved individual found in the bus was indeed her son. The next day, Corinne and Sam flew to Fairbanks to bring home some of Chris's remains. At the coroner's office, they were given the handful of possessions recovered with the body: Chris's rifle, a pair of binoculars, the fishing rod Ronald Franz had given him, one of the Swiss Army knives Jan Burrs had given him, the book of a plant lore in which his journal was written, a Minolta camera, and 5 rolls of film, and not much else. The coroner passed some papers across her desk. Sam signed them and passed them back. Less than 24 hours after landing in Fairbanks, Corinne and Sam flew on to Anchorage, where Chris's body had been cremated following the autopsy at the Scientific Crime Detection Laboratory. The mortuary delivered Chris's ashes to their hotel in a plastic box. "I was surprised to see how big the box was," Corinne says. "His name was printed wrong. The label said Christopher R. McCandless. His middle initial was really J. It ticked me off that they couldn't even get it right. I was mad. Then I thought, Chris wouldn't care. He'd think it was funny." They caught a plane for Maryland the next morning. Corinne carried her brother's ashes in her knapsack. During the flight home, Corinne ate every scrap of food that the cabin attendant set in front of her, even though, she says, it was that horrible stuff they serve on airplanes. "I just couldn't bear the thought of throwing away food since Chris had starved to death." Over the weeks that followed, however, she found that her appetite had vanished. She had lost 10 pounds, leading her friends to worry that she was becoming anorexic. Back in Chesapeake Beach, Billy had stopped eating too. A tiny 48-year-old woman with girlish features, she lost 8 pounds before her appetite finally returned. Walt reacted the other way, eating compulsively, and gained 8 pounds. A month later, Billy sits at her dining room table, stifling through the pictorial record of Chris's final days. It's all she can do to force herself to examine the fuzzy snapshots. As she studies the pictures, she breaks down from time to time, weeping as only a mother who has outlived her child can weep, betraying a sense of loss so huge and irreparable that the mind balks at taking its measure. Such bereavement, witnessed at close range, makes even the most eloquent apologia for high-risk activities ring fatuous and hollow. I just don't understand why he had to take those kinds of chances, Billy protests through tears. I just don't understand. All right, and that is the end of chapter 13. So we'll pick up next week with chapter 14, and this is the titled the uh, Stick-Iron Ice Cap. So it looks like we're going to pick up back more with Chris and the rest of his journey. We've obviously skipped ahead to what happened afterwards, but now we're going to get some more backstory about uh, Chris himself. So until next time, bye.